Okay, Yohei, take it away.
Okay, everyone, welcome. Thank you for being here today. Before we start, we will do a land acknowledgement. I'm sorry, and I would like to welcome Denise for the land acknowledgement.
I thank you. I'm Denise Cole, she, her, they, them, and I live in Goose Bay, Labrador. I recognize that we don't know where everyone is from, so I'm very humbled that I've been offered the opportunity as an Indigenous Two-Spirit to give the land acknowledgement this evening. And so, as I said, I don't know where everyone is from, but I do know that all of us are places where Indigenous people uh, are there, and that these are all unceded lands that all of us live on, and they're traditional lands of different First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, or if you're international, even more beautiful diversity of Indigenous people as well. For myself, I live in Labrador, which is the traditional lands of the Inuit and the Innu. And I also would like to recognize that many of you, including the host and the panelists, are in Newfoundland, which are the traditional lands of the Mi'kmaq and the Beothuk. So I would just like us to honor that the lands we are on, that we treat things in a good way, and that we ask the ancestors to bring good energy to our conversations this evening, and that we understand that what we do impacts the next generations. And with that, I will humbly pass it back over and say I'm looking forward to this evening.
Thank you so much, Denise. That was beautiful. I would like to start introducing myself. My name is Yohei. I use he, him. I'm part of the Community-Based Research Center. And the CBRC is a nonprofit organization that promotes the health of 2S LGBTQAI+ community. And this is an intervention piece that was born from the Pivot, which was a 4-day in-person workshop, which didn't finish in person, unfortunately, because we hit the beginning part of the pandemic. However, after the discussion of that pivot and participants, what they wanted to create after the discussion and this intervention piece is the result of all the discussion that they had in the first pivot. So now I would like to pass on to Charlie so that Charlie can talk about the quad as well.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Charlie Murphy. I go by he, him, they, them pronouns. Like Yohei, I'm part of CBRC. I'm the Newfoundland Labrador regional rep. I'm also the new executive director of Quadrangle, which is our current brand new charity for the 2S LGBTQIA community of trying to get a community center for our province. And we are making strides and we're going to get there. But that is me. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jen, who was one of the participants from our first pivot project. And they will guide us through this discussion. And myself and Yohei will disappear and you will just see the speakers, the moderator, and the ASL interpreters for the rest of the evening. So thank you so much for coming.
Sorry, I'm trying to share the screen, not share it with people. I'm presenting is what I want to be doing. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for being here today. Super thrilled to be having this conversation. We all met last night just to have a brief discussion before today, and honestly, that conversation was fantastic. So I have a feeling today's is going to be excellent. I'm super looking forward to it. Yeah, thanks for introducing me, Charlie. I'm Jen. My pronouns are she, they. Like Charlie said, I was a volunteer with this program. It was an awesome experience. We did a lot of learning. I can't even tell you how many people we met at this point. Just like the amount of community members that have stepped up and wanted to have really awesome conversations has been fantastic. So I just want to say thanks to the speakers who are here today. And thanks to everybody else who's also participated, because this has been a fantastic experience and I'm thrilled to have been a part of it. We have one more left, like 3 weeks from today, and the topic is sexual health activism. So you can check our social media because that'll be coming out soon enough. But for today, we're going to be talking about sexual liberation, so sex and porn and media, and that sort of sex work, that conversation. Before we get started, Just a little note about privacy. So because you are attending this webinar, your name will be showing up if you do ask a question in the live chat or in the Q&A. So if you don't want to be identified, you can change your name to something. Doesn't matter what it is. It could literally be anything. Yeah, but just know that you are, recognized in this webinar. If you want to ask questions throughout, like, feel free. You don't have to wait until the end. I will probably give like a 15-minute heads up if you want to, but feel free to just pop them in and we will address them. If you do want to know more about privacy, because I don't know a whole lot, you can visit zoom.us//privacy. They could be able to answer questions, or you can reach out to Charlie or Yohei. Maybe they can pop their emails in the chat if you have more questions, because I'm not a privacy expert. So for the mission mandate of Pivot, or our uncovered sex at the kitchen table, we basically just wanted to have a relaxed and inclusive space where we could have fun conversations, which is why we're all here today. And I'm not gonna go into too much detail here. So I want to introduce the people who are joining us. So we have Heather Jarvis, we have Ryan Reed, and Valerie Weber. I'm gonna let them introduce themselves a little bit because I'm sure they can tell you more about them than I could. Doesn't matter who goes first, but I would love to know from all three of you why you're here today, maybe what brings you to this conversation, maybe why you are even interested in sexual liberation, bit of your personal experience. Feel free to share as much or as little as you'd like. Doesn't matter who. I'm going to stop sharing this now. So anybody jump in whenever you're ready. I could call on somebody if that's less intimidating. Ryan's ready. Let's go.
I'll go. So my name is Ryan Reed and my pronouns are he, him, his. I am a queer cisgendered male. And what brings me here today is Yohei reached out to me as a last minute, needing a queer man to take part in it, who was comfortable talking about sex and sexual liberation. My own experience, I guess, I came from a fundamentalist Christian background. All throughout my teenage years, I was a part of the purity culture movement, purity ring and all, girlfriend and all. And so it was really important for me to be here because sexual liberation has been a journey. And from sort of a repressive ideology to finding a space for more sex positive and sexual diversity. So that's what I'm bringing to the table tonight.
Welcome. Valerie or Heather? Maybe Valerie?
Hi, folks. My name is Heather Jarvis. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm really excited and honored to be here. I think that conversations about sexuality, but definitely about sexual liberation, have been a part of my activism and a part of the communities that have raised me, continue to raise me, that I might be nurturing for a really long time. So I was actually born in South Africa and immigrated to Canada as a young child. I grew up largely in Ontario, but I've actually lived in many places around the world. So I really appreciated, Denise, your kind of acknowledgement of there's always going to be incredible Indigenous histories, legacies, nurturing of our spaces from wherever we come. So I just usually, as a very white, redheaded lady, I'm just usually saying to people, I live here now. That's fine. And I currently am actually along the southern shore outside of St. John's. I love living rurally. And part of my activism has just been about being in communities with queer and trans folks in spaces where people were addressing poverty and homelessness. Sex workers have always been a really big, important feature of my community. And so part of my activism has been around addressing sexual violence with the Slut Walk movement, working with queer and trans youth in group homes, the AIDS rights movement, HIV rights movement, and definitely now sex workers' rights. So I work for Safe Harbor Outreach Project, known as SHOP, the first and only sex worker rights organization in Newfoundland and Labrador. And I'm incredibly proud to be in community with so many people here because our communities overlap all the time. And I'm honored to know Valerie and get to know all of you some more. So Valerie, what about you?
Nice segue. This is when my cat has just decided to come and mess up my stuff. Okay, so she might appear. My name's Valerie Weber. This is Cleo. My pronouns are she, her. Yeah, so I'm a volunteer at SHOP and have been since I moved here about 5 years ago now, almost. Before I spent kind of my coming of age time in Montreal, which I moved to specifically to get out of rural living in New Brunswick and to get involved in the porn industry. So I had moved there in 2002 and got involved in webcamming back in the day. And that's actually really where my, I guess, politicization began, was in sex worker circles, which overlapped with kink circles, which overlapped with poly circles, and all of these different communities that were generally living outside of the kind of normative sexual. Everyone on the outside circle of my wheel here, and then I did actually. Against my better judgment, got into university and I'm still in university 4 degrees later, which is how I kind of came into sexuality studies as an academic field. And HIV activism was part of one of the courses that I took. So that got me into sexual health, sex education, and the ways that that's a really interesting, for me, the most fascinating area of like where justice and liberation and community cross over. So I've been involved in HIV activism and sex worker activism, and currently I'm a PhD candidate in community health. So working with public health and porn production, looking at sort of occupational health issues in the industry. And yeah, so those are the various ways I come to this conversation.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so for folks who don't know, the title of this webinar today is Sexual Liberation. I want to know from your opinion, all three of you, doesn't matter who goes first, what does it mean, or what do you think of when you hear the word sexual liberation? And I know yesterday when we were talking about it, I can't remember who, but somebody mentioned like the nuance between individual versus structural liberation. I'm wondering if anybody wants to talk to that as well. Whoever feels comfortable going first.
I'd love to jump in because this has been in my head all day. I was showering and washing my hair and trying to look more put together in the pandemic, which apparently some kindergartners call this a pandemic, and I want to call it that forevermore. I digress. But I was thinking a lot, around this conversation about, I think that there are two really important streams when we can talk about sexual liberation. There's our individual journeys and our collective work. And one doesn't come before the other. And I also don't think we ever reach an end line, a finish line on sexual liberation. I think it's a constant effort. But really thinking about when we're focusing on our own individual sexual liberation, unpacking and unlearning some of the harmful environments we grew up in, huge self-doubt, grief, healing from violence, surviving violence, dealing with self-harm, coping mechanisms, good, bad, complicated, self-expression, pleasure. That's such a complicated mess of baggage to unpack, especially when you are outside the norm. But then there's collective sexual liberation, because we really have to take care of each other and show up for each other. And if we finish our journey, or if we think our journey only extends to ourselves, we are truly leaving so many people behind. Because there have always been, and there still is now, so many people who are still at the bottom denominator. They are still so far on the margins that they are not able to show up in these conversations, or get out of an unsafe house, or get into an urban center. They're incarcerated, they're over-criminalized. There's just so many factors about fighting for collective rights, fighting for collective protections, fighting for spaces where the people with the least resources and power are defining what safety looks like so that they can be liberated. So that's just really what I think about. And to a degree, this might sound harsh, but if all you care about is your own individual sexual liberation, please step aside and get out of our way, because we have work to do. So that's kind of where I've really been thinking about this.
Casual shower thoughts.
Yeah, which obviously ties into a huge amount of when we talk about the 2S LGBTQ community. This is a holistic, inclusive, constantly expanding, evolving community. When we talk about what does it mean as settlers to be an Indigenous solidarity, what is the sex worker rights movement? These are not individual elements, these are collective. So that's where my head has really been buzzing, and it's been fun.
Awesome. Valerie or Ryan?
I can jump in with my shower thoughts from earlier, although I did not wash my hair. Dirty, very dirty. Yeah, I think one of the reasons that I can get hesitant around certain versions of the sexual liberation conversation when it is more individualized and psychologized is not because those things aren't important. I think our own, journey to coming to like a comfortable place, a comfortable relationship with sexuality is super important and super interesting. And similar to what Heather was saying, I don't think there's an end, place. At least there hasn't been for me. It's, ever evolving. But I think one of the things that troubles me with that sort of uncritical sex positivity, I would call it, is that it often kind of implies that there's some authentic sexuality that I have to get over my repression to find. My cat is messing with my couch. That's what the sound is. She does not like this. But yeah, that there's some kind of like pure or true or genuine, authentic sexuality that I have to journey to go get to. And anytime I hear the word authentic, I kind of, I get really resistant, because when we think about the institutions that want to constrain how people have sexuality, they often hinge that on or base that on the notion that there is a good, right, proper, authentic reason or type of sexuality, that an authentic sexuality looks a certain way, that it serves a certain purpose. And especially when it comes to looking at sex media and pornography in particular, the idea that it misrepresents sex, that it is an inauthentic form of sexuality, has been one of the party lines in criticism of the kinds of sexuality that might be displayed there. And so I get very nervous when it feels like the conversation is looking to uncover truth in sex. So yeah, that's what I was pondering in the shower earlier.
Ryan, what were you thinking about in the shower?
Good question. I'm actually, I said this last night too when we did our warm meeting, that I was kind of trying to figure out where my space was to come from when it came to this topic. Obviously, Heather and Valerie, as we've heard in their introductions, have an immense amount of experience working in different organizations, et cetera, throughout their careers that have really gotten them in touch with things that, for me, as sort of a lay person, I suppose, I'm learning from these humans. So for me, my path into this, I guess, is trying to figure out how the idea of, as Valerie just said, the sort of right or pure sort of sexual expression is probably where I'm coming from a personal standpoint, learning how to recognize for oneself one's own sexual experiences, I suppose, coming from a repressive is the only word I can really find right now, and then trying to figure out, well, there's nothing really wrong with having waiting for marriage or like a right or wrong sexual ethic necessarily, but it's when it's enforced, whatever that is, that we, I think we can kind of, that's a conversation worth having on an individual level. But I agree with what both Heather and Valerie said. It has to not be just individual. We have to look at it as a communal thing, because we are all a part of this, and we don't want to leave people out, which we can often do. We can get very personal as humans, and we forget that, my journey is my journey, but there are other people's journeys that we have to also bring along and give space to. So I'm just trying to sort of figure out how I'm going to do that in this webinar and moving forward, because it's a willingness to learn. And I think that my space here tonight is also to learn.
To toot your horn a little bit, Ryan, you were also doing some amazing activism, right, around Springdale and taking up the mantle for not just you, but for larger communities. So, you know, toot, you get to be like, I can learn. We're always learning. All of us are, but you're also doing, and that's amazing.
Taylor, I see you. Yeah. I'm wondering, so we talked about sexual liberation. We're interchangeably talking in some ways about porn, about sex work, about performance, you know, burlesque. We talked about yesterday about strippers, about burlesque performers. I'm wondering, how has those communities, how has the porn community, and by the porn community, I just mean communities that involve themselves in porn, because they're not a monolith. How have communities broadly contributed to sexual liberation? Like, what is that driving force? Why is sex work involved? Anybody? You can go.
I'll jump in a bit, just because you said porn, so I always, but yeah, I mean, I think that when you look at, like you said, the aggregate of people making porn, the non-mainstream, sort of typical what we would see on, you know, page 1 of Pornhub, you got to dig to at least page 10 to really get the good stuff. But no, if you look at the kinds of things that communities have been doing for creating their own content, creating the content that they want to see that represents themselves, there's a lot of very interesting collectives and festivals and projects that have been going on for years that are ways for people to show expressions of sexuality that they haven't seen elsewhere. You got to go to page 10. At the same time, before we dig too far into that, I do always need to say my little soapbox bit about that sometimes, while I'm very excited by communities making their own content and making, you know, festivals to celebrate that content, when we talk about finding porn that does or does not represent communities, I think it's important to remember that people might want to watch porn for a whole wide variety of reasons that aren't always about identifying, that aren't always about politics, that aren't always aspirational, and that, you know, I want to do the thing that I'm watching. We often talk about porn in this way that it's very, the assumption is that you watch something that emulates what you want to be or what you want to do. And that's often, for sure, one of the reasons that we watch porn, but there's anecdotally and scholarly lots of evidence that we like to watch porn that doesn't match our politics, doesn't match our identities, doesn't match the kind of sex we want to have or even think anyone should be having, you know, that there's a lot of other reasons that we engage with media other than, you know, representation that we can see ourselves in, and that's okay. Like, I think with the queer communities that I've been involved with, there can sometimes be this pressure that, like, my porn viewing has to be politically correct, or my porn viewing has to be community-based, or my porn viewing has to be part of this, what we would identify as liberatory movement. And I absolutely would love to share with everyone all kinds of great companies and festivals where we can throw our money at to support those kinds of productions and entities. At the same time, sometimes I want to watch the most politically problematic, you know, white bread kind of stuff, or I want to watch things for reasons that aren't even entirely sexual, you know, and that we not hold ourselves too hostage by the notion that our porn viewing means that much about who we are as people. So I think I got way off track of what you asked about, but just before we talk about all the great ways that porn can be liberating and representative and politically empowering, that it also can be not those things. And that's okay, so long as we're paying for it. That's my last piece on that, sorry.
No, don't apologize. Ryan or Heather, did you want to step in on maybe why sex work or burlesque or performance have been a driving force in sexual liberation, or how they play into this conversation?
Well, I think, especially when I think about a lot of things, sexual liberation, when I think about, you know, 2S LGBTQ communities, when I think about pride, I so often just always am in awe of the people who've come before us, that like we wouldn't even be here having conversations, connecting with each other without the people who put themselves really out there on the line and created incredible movements and events. And I think that that's just incredible, that we've had this battle and we've had this fight. But I also think that we need to start seeing, like I was sort of saying before, all of our sexual liberation, even when it's individual, but we have to see it as connected to each other. So I think if we think about drag, burlesque, stripping, sex work, porn, watching porn, making porn, making home porn, making porn on larger sets, they're actually all just in a mixed bag continuum and web. They are not these individual things as easily as we would like to place them. They're different forms of expression that are either made to be more acceptable or far less acceptable, or more fun, pleasure, empowerment, or more degradation. And oh, nobody would ever want to do that. You know, even in sex work, there's a term, and when I say sex work, I mean an umbrella of experiences. Sex work can refer to, as an umbrella, a whole wide variety of sexual services or erotic labor that includes cam work, adult massage parlors, porn, escorting, professional fetish work in which sometimes no sex act actually even happens. But if we think about sex work, often there's a term that sex workers have coined that's called the whorearchy, which is like hierarchy, but whorearchy, because sex workers get to say things like whore and hooker. Other people don't do that. But we always put things in this acceptability, and like drag and burlesque are really popular and fun and totally acceptable in a lot of our communities. And people who are making hard cash for fucking are not. And we really need to think about that, that we enjoy watching porn or we enjoy watching sexualized experiences. But as soon as we cross this line, whatever we think that is, that it becomes problematic and it becomes dirty and it becomes, oh, well, now it has to be all about the politics and not about the fun, you know, and that's the conversation that I really want us to have more often.
Ryan, did you want to hop in?
Sure. Yeah, I totally agree with what both Valerie and God, my mind is blanking. What was said already, and you know, we talked about burlesque, we talked about drag as being sort of acceptable forms of entertainment that also push the bounds of sex and sexuality as being kind of like popularized now, because we have like, you know, RuPaul's Drag Race, for example, with drag and everything, and then we have like burlesque has become so much more, so I guess, socially acceptable now, even though like it used to be more sort of on the margins, I suppose, when it first started. But when we look at like, you know, stripping and getting paid for other forms of sex work, there's a shame, and it makes no sense. But it's like we've been programmed to think like if you are paying for sex, or if you are a stripper or whatever, that there's like some kind of like moral thing that goes along with that isn't necessarily seen when people think of drag and burlesque, because it's like, it's more like, oh, it's just strip tease, you know, nobody's like having sex and nobody's like actually, you know, so like we take that sexual shame that we've had for so fucking long and we put it on, you know, on stripping and all these other forms. And it's really hypocritical, because a lot of times we're watching these things and we're taking in these things, and yet we're like, oh, but no, that's dirty. And it's like, come on.
I know yesterday when we had talked about it, I think Heather, you had mentioned something about the rise in pole fitness versus and pole fitness and being socially acceptable on, say, like Instagram platforms or those sorts of, you know, social media. But we talked about how, like, when somebody's profiting from it or they're making money from it, that's when it's typically there's a shadow ban or there's some sort of restriction put on their account. But I'm wondering, because that was a super interesting conversation, I'm wondering, Heather, in particular, if you could speak to what it means to decriminalize versus legalize sex work. If you could just touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, and you know, this idea of sex work being this clear-cut identifiable box that I want to bust open, because people exchange sex for all kinds of reasons, sometimes for pleasure, sometimes, let's be real, we're really selfish and we just want somebody else to help us get off. And let's not be mean to people, and let's always make sure that's consensual. But I think if we're going to just be honest with people, let's be honest with people. And what I love is that sex workers also honor that. They're like, this is some of the most honest form of intimacy and sexual engagement, because you can say, this is how much time I have, this is what's on the menu, this is absolutely what's not on the menu, what do you need? And especially if a lot of clients are elderly, or because a lot are, they can talk about like, this position is really not good for me, hey, I actually can't reach climax and come, so but this is what I like. And so sex work is really honest. And why don't we, you know, put that into, let's learn from sex workers around other ways we can be sexually liberated with each other and with ourselves. And so, but we still criminalize so much of sex work. We still draw these harsh lines about do what you want to in your own bedroom for fun, but as soon as we exchange any resources or money, hard line. And I think a lot of people are having this conversation more and more. I mean, I was brought into sex worker rights by other sex workers who called me out sometimes for messing up. Thank you to them. So a lot of people who are already at the point to say, sex workers are okay, they should be valued. How do we support them? And a lot of really well-intentioned allies put their foot in their mouths and they say, we should just legalize it. And a lot of sex workers say, please shush and move aside so that we can tell you what's really going on. And then you come and back us up, not take the lead. And so when we think about legalization versus decriminalization, I really want people to think about it with our current cannabis legalization. So cannabis, marijuana was illegal, and then the Canadian government changed that. But what did that actually look like? That didn't actually look like taking all criminal laws out. It just meant shifting what they looked like. Yes, you can buy it, and yes, you can smoke it, but when and where and how old do you have to be? And can you drive with it? And can you fly with it? And how much can you grow? And how can you sell it? And who gets to grow it? And who gets to buy it? So the government takes a huge element of control. They have their hand in everything. They are controlling monopolies of business. They are controlling buyers and sellers. They are controlling where you can do it. That changes across provinces. And realistically, the government has a very bad track record with doing right by sex workers. We do not want the government to have that much control. So we don't want legalization that just shifts what the criminal laws look like, because people are still breaking the laws when they do it in some way. What we want is decriminalization. And all that is saying all of the pieces that are a criminal offense, remove them and allow other laws to do the work they need to do. Because you know what? We have laws against sexual assault, physical assault, kidnapping, confinement, underage, laws of age of consent, laws against sexual exploitation underage, laws against human trafficking. We have laws up the wazoo. Let them work. We don't actually need more laws to criminalize sex workers. So decrim is just take those criminal aspects when it's about adults, when it's obviously consensual, away, and don't put in new laws and don't give the government that much control. So that's what sex workers advocate for around the world. It's also backed up by the World Health Organization, Amnesty International, UNAIDS, the Global Alliance Against Trafficking in Women and Girls, lots of other people who've done research. So please, if you're going to be an amazing ally, decrim is what we want.
Thanks for that distinction. I don't know, Valerie or Ryan, did you want to hop in on this one at all? Are you feeling this question?
That was a great analogy with the cannabis situation. I got nothing to add.
Valerie, I love your reactions also. Just you over there like, yes, it's so fun to watch you. Ryan, did you have anything?
If I can add one more other piece, yeah. Because a lot of people say, but shouldn't we just have these really stringent laws to protect people? And they often think about the porn industry, and Valerie, this is where you might have extra thoughts, and but about, you know, we should mandate testing. People should have to get STI testing, and they should have to use condoms, and we should have to make people who work in massage parlors get STI testing. And really what that does is that just creates another underground market, because when somebody inevitably might have chlamydia and they still have to work, they're going to find another way to do it. And that's not always about the best health and safety and wellness of the people doing the work. So even those good intentions just lead to saying certain people, you have to go underground and we will care about you less. And you know, the porn industry has taught us a lot about mandatory condom use is actually can lead to more bleeding, more tearing, more friction. So we really need to think about what people actually need and not think, well, STIs and sex workers and, you know what, college students are having a lot more unprotected, random, unsafe sex than sex workers are, I can tell you that much.
Yeah, I got a lot of thoughts on that, but I don't. So Ryan, I'll let you go first though, if, on the decrim question.
Sure. I just wanted to say that I was one of the people that didn't really know the difference between decriminalization and legalization. So that analogy really, like, now I know that, and it makes so much more sense than, you know, because I would have been one of those people who was like, yeah, legalize, because I didn't have the information. So I'm glad to now have the information going forward.
I love a good analogy. Honestly, they get me every time.
It's like the best way, certainly for me, it's one of the best ways to learn something is to like give me a parallel. And that's one of the things about mandatory condom laws. I was trying to make a parallel with PPE. Yeah, that mandatory condom laws was the reason I got involved in the research that I'm doing now. And so for people that don't know, there was a period of, it's actually on my chalkboard, which you can't see because I put up this Gail Rubin thing, but the condom wars, I would call, ran more or less from 2004 to 2020. It's kind of gone to the back burner now that we have the whole neo-human trafficking attack on porn is the new approach that people are taking. But for a long time in California, which is the only state in the US where porn production is technically legal. Well, it and New Hampshire, but California is where the bulk of it's been produced. It's technically the only state where it's legalized, and therefore subject to state intervention, which is bad. And so the CalOSHA, which is California Occupational Safety and Health Agency, there was debate for a long time about whether or not porn production should fall under the mandate of this occupational health and safety agency. And of course, all of the people hoping to be good allies to porn workers thought, well, of course we want to help them. We want to make sure that there's something in place to hold producers accountable so that performers are not being put at undue risk in their job. We're not going to ask them what they would like, though. We're just going to decide it should probably be condoms, because when you think about safe sex, you just think condoms. And so we'll just apply that to this completely different context that is, you know, the amount of time that you spend on actual penetration, if you're doing a scene with penetration, is much more than the average, twirl on the college campus. So a lot of people, everyone that I spoke to said, you know, they like to have the option to use condoms sometimes if they were having an off day or depending on the scene or how well they knew their co-star that day, but they didn't want it mandated because a lot of times it would cause, micro abrasions, friction. It just complicates filming. I have filmed with condoms. Because I was not filming as often as a lot of career porn performers. So for me, it wasn't as big of an issue, but even then it complicates your filming day a lot. It'll stretch it out and everyone's more grumpy and tired by the end of the day. And it just makes everything difficult. But instead, what the industry had done on its own was put in this mandatory testing, which again, it was mandatory in that certain studios would opt in to be part of this system. Then if someone did test positive for HIV, for example, they could kind of do contact tracing, which everyone's very familiar with now. Porn did it first. But it was optional and it was industry instigated. And now there's problems with mandatory testing as well, it excludes people who are HIV positive from performing within that system. And that's a whole other conversation that is would take a long time to get into, but essentially it hasn't kept up with the science of HIV medication and what is actually the various options of safe sex. And I think that's when we talk about what have these different movements or communities brought to sexual liberation, I think the HIV movement, like HIV rights movement, in terms of thinking about ways that the criminal justice system gets involved in people's sexuality. HIV criminalization law is an egregious intervention into people's sex lives, and it also hasn't kept up with the science or with what just like actually works for public health prevention. And so that's an area where even the strategies that the industry has developed for itself have not taken into account who does that exclude? How does that keep other people from having to work or from being able to work in ways that are safe and accessible? So it's whenever we build a regulation, someone gets left out, and so we always have to be looking at who can't work, who cannot be legalized or included within that standard that we've set, and then think about ways to expand it so that those people can be brought in.
Yeah, and like even if we think about that in the ways that it's in the porn industry and it's around sex work, but look at like the Canadian blood ban on men who have sex with men and also sex workers. So this is happening not in a work business regulated context. And so, if we have examples, but even if we had more examples of people in positions of power like government, just out of fear and complete misinformation saying, you know what, people who have anal sex, they have to get tested by their family doctors every single time they come in. Or, people who are non-binary and trans, we just don't know and we have fear, therefore we're going to implement this invasion into your sex life. We would hopefully riot a lot more than we do now.
Yeah. I'm sorry if anybody can hear my cat, by the way. She's meowing right outside the door. But I'm just gonna leave it for now. I do want to let anybody know who's watching. We got about a little bit over 10 minutes left. So if you have questions, you want to pop them in, we're gonna keep going for now. But if you do want to get them in, feel free. How has sexual liberation affected our healthcare system? How has it interacted with that structure? I'm wondering, I don't know who wants to jump in on this one first, but what systems does sexual liberation impact or affect?
As somebody who has the privilege of being in the urban center, I'd really love to hear from you, Ryan, around not being in the city center and being, often in rural communities and what you've seen and what you've learned.
Yeah, I think definitely in rural communities, particularly because I did grow up in rural communities. I'm fortunate enough to be in the city and have more of that, but certainly the rural communities, just sexuality in general is pretty non-existent, I guess, in terms of like feeling comfortable, say, going to a doctor, your family doctor who literally has known you since you were like 6 years old, or knows everybody else in the community, and like you're such in a small confined space. And I remember going to get my first ever like STI test while I was living in my hometown, and being like so petrified to go and even ask to get tested, because I like knew this doctor from like my church, and like it was like this really like awkward thing for me. So I think like in sort of rural communities, I think there's still a shame around going and trying to get these really important tests done and trying to really take care of your sexual health. At least that's in my experience in the rural communities. I think also as a gay man, we just mentioned the whole blood ban thing. The fact that we cannot give blood, and it's a huge predatory issue that hasn't kept up with the science of HIV and AIDS, and it's purely homophobic. And so I think like there's a sense that we've had all this sexual liberation, and then people are still, with the Canadian blood ban, the residue of the 1980s AIDS scare and the gay disease. And so there was liberation in the 70s, for example, with like the sexual liberation, gay rights movement. Then the 80s sort of put a bit of a close on that because of HIV AIDS. And then there was the stigma again and the shame. And unfortunately, with that whole thing, as we see with the Canadian Blood Services, that has still not fully changed for gay men in particular, with that coming from a gay man's perspective.
Can I ask, now that you have moved to St. John's, like what are some of the biggest things that you've seen in maybe healthcare here that you know, some of the key things that you want to advocate for or we need in rural communities?
Well, I think that having something like Planned Parenthood, where literally you can go and have, you know, tests done, or for example, having a space where you know that there is this inclusion and this not shame around being tested for STDs or whatever, being a queer person and going into these spaces where there's not as much comfortability going to sort of a mainstream, I guess, for lack of a better word, sort of heteronormative. These are just words that are coming to me. They're not the best explanations, but certainly, you know, there's a difference because we have these other spaces, and Planned Parenthood is the one I can think of because that's where, you know, they do testing and everything. We don't have anything like that in rural communities. I don't know how we could move forward and try to create that, but certainly there's a need for it because the shame and unspokenness about sexuality in rural communities, particularly sexuality that goes against the grain, is sadly, I think, in a very, very dire space. And I don't know the solutions for that problem, but certainly I think for our young people, particularly in rural communities who can't leave rural communities, there needs to be something that can help them with their sexual health in a way that doesn't make them feel shame.
Or Heather, did you want to jump in on how you think the sexual liberation interacts with the healthcare system, or does it?
I'm not having any brilliant thoughts come to mind. I mean, I guess I'm thinking of, you know, reproductive health and you know, variations on ways that we access things like sexual health testing, and all of that are places where, you know, people have done a lot of work to create and keep having to do the work. I mean, I think that's what's so frustrating is that like every gain doesn't ever seem, you know, finalized. It's a constant. But, you know, I've been trying to think about this for, you know, in the industry, we've been talking about how to have some kind of sexual health standards or systems to help people do testing if they want to. Now that the industry is increasingly decentralized, increasingly democratized, it's OnlyFans everywhere, it's cams everywhere. There's no, it's like, it's not LA as the hub anymore, and you have to go to LA to be involved in the industry. People are working everywhere. So these brick and mortar testing entities aren't serving the purpose that they used to. And I think about rural communities all the time as like, how do we get like mail-in testing happening? How do we get other ways of anonymous testing? And I was once a test subject in at home, like an HIV rapid test that they were working on. And a lot of the questions that we had to answer showed that their concerns around approving something like an at-home HIV test, which you can buy in the States. There's none approved in Canada currently. A lot of it, of course, they're concerned that it's effective. You know, you don't want someone getting a false positive or a false negative for different reasons when they're home. But at the same time, you think about home pregnancy tests. And I would love to, I've never looked up the history of when the home pregnancy test became available, but how much that has increased people's ability to anonymously find out information that is really important to their sexual health, and that you want to be able to do that anonymously so that you are not already under state surveillance at the time that you access that information. Because especially with HIV being criminalized the way it is, if I test I do not believe I think it's still the case that there is nowhere that you can anonymously test in Newfoundland and Labrador, right? So that means that if I go get tested, there is going to be a record in the public health statistics that I'm positive. And if I then have sex with someone and I have not both used some kind of protection and I have an undetectable viral load through medication suppression, then I can be held criminally liable for aggravated sexual assault and wind up on a sex offender registry, potentially serve jail time, all of that, because it takes those two conditions to be considered a low risk. I forget the exact term they use. It's negligible risk or something. Otherwise, I have to disclose. And of course, disclosing HIV status is not something that everyone wants to do all the time, especially if you know that you pose no risk of transmission because you're going through the necessary precautions. So giving people the chance to test anonymously is a very important way to give them some agency, because if I'm afraid I might be positive and I don't want to be held criminally liable, my best bet is to not find out, because then I can't be held accountable by the law and serve this time. So I forget how I got started talking about this, but essentially that, some kind of at-home testing is something that people in health authorities seem very afraid to let people do. I don't know what they think is going to happen. Some of the concern, of course, is that if you find out you have a positive diagnosis and you're home alone, maybe you're going to, have a mental health issue and it's going to be problematic. But I don't think that's a good reason to deny these kinds of technologies to places where you don't have access to a clinic. You don't have access to, even if you do have a clinic, the doctor knows you since you were 6 and maybe you don't want to go there, So that's something that comes to mind for me.
Yeah, fair point. Heather, did you want to jump in, or maybe if anybody has anything they want to add?
I think, all of this about, we can feel like there's gains and then there's still so much work to do around, I was shocked when I moved to St. John's and found that Newfoundland and Labrador had no anonymous HIV testing. Shocked. And it's been 5 years and it's still the same. And the fact that, Ryan, we have one Planned Parenthood in the entire province, and people don't even have access to doctors in some of our communities. And we're still fighting the blood ban, which is both against men who have sex with men and against sex workers. There's also a question that says if you have exchanged sex for money or resources.
And about working with monkeys.
Oh, interesting. I almost want to say, is that one like the one that's more scientifically based, maybe, because the rest aren't. But even beyond that, it's amazing that we now in this province have a healthcare system that is finally trying to work through trans surgeries and covering them through our health body. And that has taken so much fight and battle from so many people, but there's still a lot of barriers and it's still very limited. For the entire province, there are 5 people you can go to sort of like get through the checkpoints to get on a list of possibly getting a surgery. But it's amazing that, parts of our governments and parts of our access points are even seeing these things as this is necessary. This is not, we're not seeing it as elective anymore. We're recognizing as necessary surgeries, as necessary healthcare. And I do try to remember those things about how people pushing for this is who I am, and these are my communities, and we get to live and we get to thrive, and how that has changed access points for healthcare. And it's a slow battle, but there are glimmers of hope. And the one thing that I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't bring into it is I think about sex care a lot, but I also think about prisons a lot. And follow me here, I'm making a point. In Newfoundland and Labrador, we're about to see a changeover where actually our health department is about to take over responsibility for people who are in prisons. And while that is a good sign, people who are incarcerated have their human rights violated all the time. They have horrible if almost nil access to adequate healthcare, and it certainly is not sexually liberating. And just because people are behind bars does not mean their sexuality and their desires and their pleasure and their bodies and their connection with other people through intimacy is not vital. But we kind of leave them behind. So this idea of how are we making sure we're actually having these conversations with everybody? Because sometimes I speak to prisoners, including trans and queer prisoners, and they're like, thank God my cellmate wasn't here today, because the only way I can let off steam is to jerk off. But you're not allowed to do that all the time. And so even that, like in prisons, sometimes you're not allowed to hug people, you're not allowed to touch other people. And so even your like touching yourself sometimes is even regulated and shut down. And so really thinking about sexual liberation for all of us. And for me, that always is like, if we include prisoners, then we really get to see how much work we have to do.
Yeah, for sure. I kind of want to, I know we're at the time here, we're kind of at the end, but I have one more question. So if somebody is on that individual sexually liberating journey, but want to be more part of a collective or want to take action or want to do some sort of advocacy, how do you be more than just an individual who's advocating for sexual liberation? Or where do you go? Who do you look to?
I want to make one quick suggestion, and then I think one interesting way to bridge from individual pursuits to collective pursuits is through porn, because if you're like looking at what can I watch to both like explore my own stuff, but also contribute to communities, think about where, what we were talking about yesterday, you know, what desires do I have? Why are they the way they are? Are they editable? What can I, consume that might help me think about these things? And using your bit of viewing and purchasing power to support. So I'm going to plug, I just heard about this yesterday. Tomorrow there is a festival called Black, Brown, and Blue. It's all BIPOC creators from around the world. It's free. It's a 5-hour film festival. So I could put the link in the chat, and then you can of course donate to these filmmakers. But following filmmakers online, like following pornographers, is a great way to hear about the politics of sex work and to be able to action some of those items, and while watching like hot porn. So it's a win-win for everybody. So I'll throw that link in there.
Everybody wins. I love that. Heather, Ryan, did you have any thoughts you want to add? Any closing remarks?
I think, even the language, the term sexual liberation can give you like a slightly slurpy headache to be like, what does this mean? What do I mean? Please don't make me define it. And it's intimidating, and this stuff can be intimidating. And so I think we need to kind of come back and recognize that everybody starts somewhere. We all grow up with, let's be frank, really fucked up problematic ideas and messages all the time. And we spend most of our life, if we're lucky, unlearning them and then learning new stuff. So, to not get too intimidated by this. If you're like, I have no idea about any of this HIV criminalization, what? We all start there. And we have other people teach us, and we have other people check us, and then on top of that, I try more and more to be always comfortable with fucking up. We all do it, and we're all going to do it again and again and again. And that's just real. And that doesn't mean we're bad people, and that doesn't mean we're not sexually liberated. We just have to be comfortable with saying we're all going to mess up. And I'm hoping I'll have people around me who will call me in, call me out, give me information, because everybody is there. And I think that's how we just learn. We just learn by seeing what we have in common with people, what we have different from people, how we show up for people who are different than us. And if I can quote this amazing value from this amazing group, but I want to actually get them right. Asian Pacific Islander anti-violence community organization. One of their values is, this is hard work, but we have the capacity to figure it out. And I love that because it doesn't mean we have all the answers. It just means we're going to work on it. And just seeing our communities is really overlapping all the time. HIV, sex work, sex for pleasure, drag, burlesque, pole dancing, stripping, jerking off in prison, like the connections are endless. So just start drawing them. And to a point that Valerie made yesterday, let's talk more about what we like in porn, even if it's really embarrassing. What a bonding experience that is.
Awesome, thank you, Heather. Ryan, any closing thoughts?
Sure, I just wanted to say that I've learned a lot tonight. As a speaker, I'm learning. It's really interesting to hear about things that you don't always think about, and that you ask yourself, okay, like, why haven't we thought about that? But we're all learning, and we're all evolving and growing and fucking up, and then whatever, so it's, for me, it's been a learning experience. I've just enjoyed listening, because I've learned so much tonight. And I just, I think it's important going forward that we just continue to have conversations about sex and sexuality in many forms, and that we realize that even though there's a stigma that's still attached, that we can just by talking about it, by having these kinds of conversations, just being so open and frank about sex and sexuality, this is all part of progress. So thank you guys for doing this, and thanks. I'm just so excited to have been a part of it.
Thank you for joining us. Awesome. I'm sure we're all gonna have some really interesting shower thoughts tomorrow or sometime the week, because it's a pandemic. Who's showering every day? Hi, Charlie and Yohei.
Hi. So we are getting close to that end mark. So before we do wrap up, I just want to talk a little bit more about some of the things that we talked about during our warm meeting, which I think we brought up a lot of those really great topics. So we talked about the fact of, doing pole dancing, and the fact, like, if someone's doing that on social media or on Instagram, the idea that them being endorsed by something because they're using it as an exercise, and therefore it's validated, versus someone who is stripping and it's seen as like a dirty thing or not a profession. The difference of looking at those things based on how we're valuing it, it's just an interesting way to kind of break it down of why are we looking at things the way we were looking at them, and how are we okaying it based on currency because someone else is saying this form of it is acceptable, but this form isn't. So I'm glad that we talked about those topics. I'm glad we were able to talk about porn in a bigger scope of not just like this big kind of industry, but also those small sections that make up what porn is. But before we close, I would just like to know, is there any form of media that you feel we should be having more sexual liberation in, like video games, regular movies, TV shows, newspapers? Like, should we be having more conversations where it's not behind these closed doors or sectioned off gates where people are being invited in and just having it broader?
Can I share maybe related to that story myself? I'm not from, let's say, rural area, but I'm from Japan, where the society and the culture is very traditional. And when I was 17, I had the access to the internet for the first time. And that's how I found out I was gay, through porn. Yeah, so, but that at that moment, one, watching porn, the shame of watching porn. Two, the shame of watching gay porn was so difficult. And I had years of being in closet until 23. So I had 6 years in closet. It feels like it's all empty. And there are not many things I regret in my life, but I really hope any kind of representation, like porn is one thing, but anything, like anything you just mentioned, I don't know, movie, TV program. I remember my mom is supporting, but I remember she was saying, watching two actors kissing in a movie, oh my God, it must be so difficult. Wow, for these actors. And that, like, I remember that really clearly, even though I was not aware that I was gay. So I think in general, that representation is needed in every single level.
I know when I see animation of any kind, because that being my background with animation design, seeing a story that's not being forced, but it's just like a very natural discussion around these two characters that are in love, or these two characters that are interested in each other, or these two characters that are just showing some kind of form of affection, always seems to pull on that like creative side of my brain, but also my sexual orientation as well. So like, it's always these things that I feel if we had more of, these conversations could feel more natural. They wouldn't have to be us starting them. They would just exist. They would just become a very natural, like our discussion is called, like at a kitchen table. You would just be talking about it more openly.
And I didn't know, for example, that in North American production, they removed queer characters from Sailor Moon. I didn't know that.
They also changed some of their genders and their orientations.
I didn't know that either. Oh, sorry, go Ryan.
Sorry, that's okay. I was going to say about representation. I think as a queer man, I think when we look at a lot of LGBTQ entertainment, let's just say, particularly that's geared towards or portraying gay men, we do tend to see a certain type, particularly body type, that is sort of elevated as sort of the thing that we should all be reaching towards. And I think, I know that women have had this issue, of course, for a long time as well. You know, what body images should it look like? How should you look? What should you look like? But I think with gay men particularly, that is kind of what's fed to us in media about the sort of ideal gay man or the ideal body image of a gay man. And I think that needs to change as well. Of course, there are other things that are much more, I mean, the inclusion of trans and non-binary people is just absolutely ridiculous as well. But the fact that we don't see different body images presented to us, because if you don't see yourself represented and you think that there's only one form of sexy or attractive, you tend to say, well, I don't see myself, so I don't feel sexy, I don't feel attractive, I don't feel that I would be desirable based on what media feeds us in many different ways, not just as gay men, but in many different ways.
I totally agree. And it makes me think of where we started this conversation around that idea of what is authentic, and is that something we should try to get to? Because one of the things that I think we chatted about a little bit in preparation for this was just touching on that notion of sometimes we think what we desire and what we think is sexy and the kind of sex we want to have and the kind of liberation we want to have is completely unique and has fallen out of the sky and it just landed in us and it is what it is what it is. And we have to really challenge that we have been fed all of this. We have been fed white bodies, we have been fed totally able bodies, we have been fed ideas of what shape bodies are, what kind of sex look like, you know, and it actually, we have to take on the work to challenge that and to say, why is it that I might find myself not attracted to this kind of person or body? It's not just because, well, I just am, you know, we have to let go of, well, I'm just not, it's out of my control. A lot of it wasn't our decision, but it is our decision whether or not we want to question it. And we need to question it. And, you know, so I think the mediums that we need to see are exactly like you said, Yohei, like we have to see it everywhere. We need to see it in books. We need to see it on Instagram. We need to see it on, you know, social media. We need to see it in porn. We need to see it in advertising. And that's going to be really hard. But, you know, I had the privilege when I lived in Ontario to go to this thing every year called the Feminist Porn Awards. And it started really small as this tiny little festival, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And there were phenomenal conversations there alone about little short kind of porn videos about a woman who had a physical disability whose name is escaping me right now. But it was like a 3-minute video, which I'm sure took months to produce, of her masturbating in her motorized chair. But they like the slow motion shots of the chair and then her leg. And when do we ever see that porn really that accessibly? At the Feminist Porn Awards, 1 year was the only time I saw that kind of porn with people with disabilities in it, who were really rocking themselves on their own terms. How often do we have access to porn that is just audio for people who are blind or hard of or visually impaired? Like, I know that there is audio porn. I helped make some several years ago because I worked in a radio station and that was fun. But really making sure that we're getting, like, the horribly oppressive triangle we have to topple is just really big. And I want us to make sure we're getting, masculine, feminine, androgynous representations, but as well as disability, and as well as race, and as well as rural communities, and as well as people who say, like, even as a queer woman, oh my God, I thought I had to like scissoring, what, because that's all I was fed, God. And when I had gay men in my life say, I hate anal sex, that's not the kind of sex I have with men in my life. And I was like, it isn't? Like, we need to have these conversations. They're kind of basic. So that's just my little piece about, seeing this representation, but making sure as we see it, we're constantly having that self-scan and check about why is it that I'm desiring this thing, this type, and what haven't I seen that I might need to reconsider?
Oh, those are really great points.
I just want to jump in quick on, just for anyone who's looking, that's Laurie Erickson and the film is called Want. And I actually have it on DVD. So maybe we could give Laurie a donation and screen it. Because I was at that one too. And yeah, I think the thing that I was talking about this a lot back when 50 Shades of Grey came out. I was on a couple of podcast conversations about, is this representative of the BDSM community? And like, of course it isn't. And that's okay if you have a bunch of other representations of the BDSM community that show the various, because people, a lot of the DOMs I knew at the time were like, oh yeah, I know people in the BDSM community like this. They're not who I want to know, but they exist. And so it was representative of a portion of very rich pieces of shit with helicopters. It was a very specific niche, but it, it covered it. But like, that's the thing, is that we're always fed, we have so few representations, be it within porn or across other mediums, that each one becomes so important because we know it might be the only representation that someone sees, both within those communities, wondering, well, I don't like anal sex, so maybe I'm not really gay, or maybe I'm not really, whatever. And that it becomes the representation that the hets and the normies and the, the heteronormative or homonormative communities see and think that's representative of this smaller community that now I'm going to base all of my judgments on. So it's kind of like a question of volume, I think, rather than policing each individual piece of creation, because it will be representative for somebody. It's just we need more of it so that we don't have to all like the L word,
100%. Well, with that, I know we went a little bit over. We started at 6:10 and we're at just almost 7:20 now. But with that being said, I just want to thank all of our speakers for coming. You've been wonderful. It's been so great to get perspective on so many different pieces and with your expertise. And thank you for our lovely ASL interpreters. You're phenomenal. It's so great to have you at all of these. It's really helping us make sure that our events are accessible. And thank you, Denise, for being a phenomenal, as always, phenomenal supporter of everything that we've been doing and giving our land acknowledgement again. You're phenomenal. I know Denise also mentioned that we've talked about Planned Parenthood, but we didn't. I just want to mention that there's also the Native Friendship Center in Labrador, and they have a program called SHIELD, which is basically the same kind of thing, but for Labrador. So Denise, if you want to come on and just say a few things about that, by all means, feel free. But I just want to let everyone know that you can all leave if you wish now. Our ASL interpreters can go. And overall, our event is over, but I know there's a few other questions that are in the chat that if people can stay around, if they can, or if they want to leave, they can, just in case that we can get those covered. But everyone else can leave. That's the end of our show. Thank you so much for coming. We have one more coming up in March. I'm trying to remember the date, but it's all about advocacy and activism.
I believe it's March 20th.
March 20th. That's our last one for the series. So that's number 8. And it's been a real long go. We've been doing this for over a year with 6 months of just the actual production of it. But we hope everyone's been enjoying them.